Blue and red lights cut through the midnight darkness like angry neon knives, painting my driveway in alternating waves of crimson and electric blue. The cruiser's engine rumbles to a stop, its headlights casting long shadows across my front lawn. Behind curtains and blinds, neighbors' faces appear like ghosts, watching, whispering, probably wondering what crime I've committed now. Heavy boots crunch on gravel. Car doors slam with the authority of law enforcement. But it's not the sheriff. I'm watching. It's the woman standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed, pointing at my house like she's identifying a crime scene. Karen Whitmore, HOA president, neighborhood tyrant, and tonight, my executioner. "That's him! Sheriff Martinez!" she shouts, her voice cutting through the night air with the satisfaction of a hunter who's cornered her prey. "The one I've been telling you about. He thinks he can just ignore every rule, every regulation we've put in place to maintain property values and community standards." Sheriff Martinez steps out of the cruiser, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. He's a good man, I should know. He carries a clipboard and wears the expression of someone who's been dragged out of bed for what he suspects might be neighborhood drama rather than actual crime. "Ma'am," he says to Karen, his voice measured and professional, "you said this was an emergency situation requiring immediate law enforcement response." Karen's chest puffs up like a peacock displaying its feathers. "It absolutely is. This man has violated multiple HOA covenants, illegal modifications to his property, unauthorized vehicles, noise violations, and tonight," she gestures dramatically toward my house, "he's hosting some kind of illegal gathering after hours." I stand on my front porch, hands in my pockets, watching this theater unfold. The illegal gathering she's referring to is me having two neighbors over for coffee to discuss her reign of terror. The unauthorized vehicle is my government-issued SUV. The illegal modifications are the security cameras I installed after she started her harassment campaign. But I don't correct her. "Not yet." "Sir," Sheriff Martinez calls to me, "could you step down here, please? I need to ask you a few questions about these allegations." I walk down my front steps slowly, deliberately. Karen's eyes gleam with triumph. She probably thinks she's watching my public humiliation. If only she knew that the man she just summoned to arrest me reports directly to me every Monday morning. "What seems to be the problem, Sheriff?" I ask, my voice calm as mountain lake water. Karen doesn't let him answer. "The problem is that you think you're above the law, above community standards, above basic decency and respect for your neighbors." I catch Sheriff Martinez's eye. There's the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth. He recognizes me now, even in the darkness. But he's a professional, and he knows I didn't call him out here at midnight just to reveal my identity. Something bigger is happening. "These are serious allegations, sir," he says, playing along perfectly. "Violation of HOA covenants can result in fines, liens against your property, even legal action." Karen practically bounces on her toes. "Exactly." Finally, someone understands the severity of the situation. "I've been trying to maintain order in this community for 3 years, and this man has been nothing but defiant." 3 years, I repeat softly, letting the words hang in the air. That's a long time to hold power over people's lives. "It's not power," Karen snaps, her voice rising. "It's responsibility. Someone has to maintain standards, or this neighborhood turns into a slum. Someone has to make the hard decisions, enforce the rules, keep property values up." Sheriff Martinez makes notes on his clipboard. "And you've documented all of these violations?" "Oh, I have files," Karen says, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Photographs, dated complaints, Written warnings. This man has received more violation notices than any other resident in our community's history. I nod thoughtfully. I'm sure those files make for interesting reading. They certainly do, Karen continues, emboldened by what she perceives as my defeat. Mailbox paint that's one shade off from approved HOA colors. Christmas lights left up 2 days past the January 15th deadline. Children's toys visible from the street. Garden gnomes in violation of the decorative statute limitations. Garden gnomes, Sheriff Martinez repeats, his pen hovering over his clipboard. Subsection 4.7 of the Community Covenants clearly states that decorative yard ornaments must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee, Karen recites from memory. No exceptions. I cross my arms and lean against my car, the government-issued SUV she's been complaining about. You know, Karen, you seem to have quite a handle on every rule and regulation. Tell me, who oversees your oversight? She blinks. I beg your pardon? Who makes sure you're following proper procedures? Who ensures you're not abusing your position? Karen's face flushes red, visible even in the flashing lights. I am elected by this community to serve their best interests. I don't abuse anything. I protect property values and maintain order. By calling the sheriff at midnight over Christmas lights and garden gnomes? By doing whatever it takes to maintain community standards, she shoots back. Even if that means dealing with residents who think they're above the rules. Sheriff Martinez looks between us, sensing the undercurrent of tension that runs deeper than HOA violations. Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification. I reach for my wallet slowly. Karen watches with the hungry eyes of a predator about to witness the kill. She has no idea that when I open that wallet, everything she thinks she knows about power and authority is about to change. But not yet. Let her savor this moment. Let her believe she's won. Because when the truth comes out, when she realizes exactly who she just tried to have arrested, the fall from her throne of neighborhood tyranny is going to be that much sweeter. Of course, Sheriff, I say, pulling out my ID. Though I think you might find this situation more complicated than either of us initially realized. Karen's smile widens. She thinks I'm stalling, making excuses. She has no idea that her reign of terror is about to end. Not with a bang, but with the quiet satisfaction of justice finally being served. The night is young, and the real show hasn't even started yet. She thinks she owns the neighborhood, but the truth? She's about to meet someone she can't control. To understand how we got to this midnight confrontation, you need to understand Karen Whitmore. She didn't become the HOA president through democratic process or community service. She seized power through sheer force of will and the ability to outlast anyone who opposed her. I moved to Willowbrook Estates 18 months ago, drawn by the quiet streets and well-maintained properties. What I didn't know was that this suburban paradise came with its own dictator. A 5'4" woman with silver hair, reading glasses that hung from a chain, and a red clipboard that had become as feared as a medieval executioner's axe. Karen's reign of terror wasn't obvious at first. It started small, as tyranny often does. Mrs. Chen next door mentioned it casually during our first conversation over the fence. "Just be careful about your mailbox," she whispered, glancing around as if Karen might be listening. Mine was the wrong shade of black. Apparently it was charcoal instead of midnight black. She fined me $200. I laughed, thinking she was exaggerating. Mailbox colors? Who has time to police mailbox colors? I learned quickly that Karen Whitmore had all the time in the world. The first violation notice appeared on my door 3 weeks after I moved in, neatly typed, officially formatted, and completely ridiculous. Vehicle parked in driveway exceeds approved length limitations as outlined in Covenant Section 7.22. B. Fine. $150. Immediate compliance required. The vehicle in question was my SUV, a standard government-issued Suburban that was maybe 6 inches longer than the Honda Civic it had replaced. I called the number on the notice. Whitmore residence, this is Karen speaking. Hi, this is your new neighbor on Maple Street. I received this violation notice about my vehicle, and I think there might be some mistake. There's no mistake, she cut me off, her voice crisp with authority. Covenant Section 7.2.b is very clear about vehicle length restrictions. Your oversized vehicle disrupts the aesthetic harmony of our community. It's just a standard SUV. Thousands of people drive them. Not in Willowbrook Estates, they don't. Not if they want to maintain our property values and community standards. I tried reasoning with her. I explained that I needed the larger vehicle for work, that it was well maintained and parked properly in my own driveway. I might as well have been talking to a brick wall. The covenant is the covenant, she said. Pay the fine and comply with regulations, or face additional penalties. That should have been my first warning about who I was dealing with. But I was still naive enough to believe this was an isolated incident, a misunderstanding between neighbors that could be resolved with patience and good faith. I was wrong on both counts. The second notice came a week later. Unauthorized landscaping modifications. My crime? Planting 3 rose bushes along my front walkway. Apparently, any changes to the visual landscape required pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee, a committee that consisted of Karen and 2 neighbors who were too afraid to disagree with her. The third notice. Non-compliant window treatments. I had installed blinds that were cream-colored instead of white. The difference was barely perceptible to the human eye, but Karen's eye was apparently superhuman when it came to detecting covenant violations. Each notice came with escalating fines and increasingly threatening language about liens and legal action. But more than the money, it was the principle that grated on me. I hadn't spent 23 years in law enforcement, rising from patrol officer to public safety director, to be bullied by a suburban tyrant with a clipboard and an inflated sense of authority. I started asking around the neighborhood, casually mentioning Karen's name in conversations. The stories that came back painted a picture of a woman drunk on the smallest possible amount of power. Tom Rodriguez, 3 houses down, told me about the Christmas light incident. My kids put up some colored lights, the traditional, red and green ones. Karen showed up at my door the next morning with her clipboard and a camera. Apparently, only white lights are permitted during holiday displays. She fined me $300 and threatened to call code enforcement if I didn't take them down immediately. Sarah Mitchell, across the street, had been fined for letting her 10-year-old son play basketball in their driveway after 6 p.m. Community quiet hours begin at sunset, Karen had informed her, writing up a $200 violation for disruptive recreational activities. The Hendersons, an elderly couple at the end of the block, had been terrorized over their garden gnomes, the same ones Karen had mentioned to Sheriff Martinez tonight. She said they were aesthetically inconsistent with the community's upscale image, Mrs. Henderson told me, her hands shaking as she recounted the story. We've had those gnomes for 40 years. My late husband gave them to me. But Karen said, if we didn't remove them, she'd have them removed for us. Every story followed the same pattern. Karen identifying some minor, often arbitrary violation, issuing an immediate fine with no warning or grace period, and threatening escalation if residents dared to resist. But it wasn't just the fines that made her dangerous. It was the systematic way she crushed any opposition. When Mike Patterson ran against her for HOA president last year, suddenly his property became the subject of intensive scrutiny. Violation notices appeared weekly. Grass too long, holiday decorations up too early, garbage cans visible from the street for 30 minutes longer than permitted. The harassment continued until Mike withdrew from the race, claiming he couldn't afford the time and money to fight Karen's endless stream of violations while also campaigning. That's when I realized what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a difficult neighbor or an overzealous HOA president. This was someone who had turned a homeowners association into her personal fiefdom, using fear and intimidation to maintain absolute control over an entire community. She targeted me because I didn't bow. When other neighbors received violation notices, they paid the fines and complied with her demands. When I received notices, I questioned them, challenged them, demanded to see the specific covenant language she was citing. That made me dangerous, in her eyes. Not because I was actually violating any reasonable community standards, but because I was showing other residents that Karen Whitmore wasn't the supreme authority she pretended to be. So she escalated. The violation notices came more frequently. The fines grew larger, and the threats became more specific. She started showing up at my door unannounced, clipboard in hand, looking for new violations to document. But Karen made one crucial mistake in her campaign against me. She assumed I was just another suburban homeowner who would eventually break under pressure, pay my fines, and submit to her authority. She had no idea that the man she was trying to intimidate spent his professional life dealing with actual criminals and real threats to public safety. She didn't know that I had been trained to recognize bullying tactics, to document patterns of harassment, and to build cases that would hold up under scrutiny. Most importantly, she didn't know that her campaign of intimidation against me and my neighbors was about to run headfirst into someone with the authority and resources to stop it permanently. But first, I needed to let her show the community exactly who she really was, without the facade of righteous authority she hid behind. I needed her to reveal the petty tyrant beneath the neighborhood watch pretense. Tonight, with Sheriff Martinez, standing in my driveway and half the neighborhood watching from their windows, Karen Whitmore was about to give the performance of a lifetime, and I was going to make sure everyone remembered it. The more she pushed, the more I realized Karen wasn't just annoying, she was dangerous. After that first round of violation notices, I thought I understood the scope of Karen's harassment campaign. Pay the frivolous fines, document her behavior, maybe eventually present evidence to the Homeowners Association to have her removed from power. I approached it like any other administrative problem, methodical, professional, by the book. I severely underestimated both her creativity and her vindictiveness. The fake noise complaints started 2 weeks after our phone conversation about my SUV. Sheriff Martinez's deputies would show up at my door, apologizing for bothering me, but explaining they had received reports of loud music, shouting, or disruptive gatherings at my address. The first time, Deputy Williams looked genuinely embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Mr." He glanced at his clipboard. The complainant didn't want to identify themselves, but they called in a noise violation. Something about loud music after 10 p.m. I had been reading a book in complete silence when the doorbell rang. "Deputy, I've been home alone all evening. No music, no television, no visitors." He nodded, making notes. "That's what I figured when I pulled up. No noise at all. But we have to respond to every call." "Of course. Can you tell me who called it?" Anonymous complaint. But, between you and me, we've been getting a lot of calls from this neighborhood lately. Same pattern. Anonymous tips about violations that don't seem to exist when we arrive. The noise complaints came twice more that weak, always anonymous, always during perfectly quiet evenings when I was home alone. Each time, deputies would arrive, find no evidence of any violation, apologize, and leave. Each time, I would spot Karen Whitmore watching from her window across the street, taking notes on her ever-present clipboard. But the fake noise complaints were just the beginning. Next came the photographs. I first noticed something was wrong when I received a violation notice for unauthorized construction activity. The notice included 2 photographs, one showing construction materials allegedly stored on my property, and another showing what Karen described as unpermitted structural modifications to the rear of the residence. The problem was, neither photograph had been taken on my property. The construction materials were clearly in someone else's driveway. You could see a different house number in the background. The unpermitted modifications were a deck that had been built by the previous owner 5 years ago and was visible in the original real estate listing photos. I called the number on the violation notice. Karen answered on the first ring. "Karen, I received your violation notice, and there are some serious problems with the evidence you've provided." "The evidence is clear," she replied with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. "Unauthorized construction materials and unpermitted modifications. The covenant is very specific about pre-approval requirements. The materials in your photograph aren't on my property, and the deck was built before I moved in." Silence. Then, "Are you accusing me of fabricating evidence?" "I'm stating facts. The photographs don't show violations on my property." "I have documentation," she said, her voice rising. "Dated photographs clearly showing covenant violations at your address. Then you won't mind if I share these photographs with the sheriff's department, along with my own time-stamped photos showing that none of these alleged violations exist on my property?" The line went dead. But Karen wasn't finished. If fake photographs wouldn't work, she'd manufacture actual violations. I discovered her next tactic by accident. I had gotten up early one morning to let my neighbor's dog out while they were out of town. As I stepped onto my front porch, I saw Karen Whitmore dragging 2 large trash bags across my front lawn, positioning them near my driveway where they'd be visible from the street. I watched from my doorway as she took out her phone and snapped several photos. Then she quickly dragged the bags back to her own property and disappeared into her garage. 2 hours later, a violation notice appeared on my door. Improper refuse storage and display. Garbage bags visible from street in violation of Section 12.4a. Fine, $250. This time, I was ready. I had installed security cameras around my property after the fake photograph incident, ostensibly for security, but really to document Karen's increasingly bold harassment tactics. The cameras had captured everything: Karen dragging the trash bags onto my property, staging the photographs, and removing the evidence. When I called her this time, my voice was completely calm. "Karen, I received your violation notice about refuse storage. I think there might be some confusion." "There's no confusion. I have photographic evidence of garbage bags stored improperly on your property." "I'm sure you do. And I have video evidence of you placing those garbage bags on my property for the purpose of taking those photographs." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had been dropped. Finally, That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. Trespassing, vandalism, filing false reports. But I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." The wind must have blown." "Karen, the video shows you dragging the bags across my lawn, positioning them for photographs, and then removing them. There was no wind. There was no accident. There was deliberate harassment." She hung up without another word. But even being caught red-handed didn't stop her. If anything, it seemed to make her more desperate and more creative. The anonymous letters started showing up in my mailbox the following week. Handwritten notes claiming to be from concerned neighbors who were worried about the decline in community standards and the negative impact on property values caused by my repeated violations and defiant attitude. Each letter was written in the same careful block printing. Each one mentioned specific violations that only Karen could have known about. Each one urged me to comply with community standards or face more serious consequences. But the most disturbing escalation came when Karen started targeting my neighbors for associating with me. Tom Rodriguez mentioned it during one of our weekend conversations over the fence. "Man, I hate to say this, but Karen's been asking questions about you. She wanted to know if you were having unauthorized gatherings, if there was excessive traffic at your house, if I'd noticed any suspicious activity." What did you tell her? I told her you were a good neighbor who minded his own business, which is more than I could say for some people. Tom grinned. She didn't like that answer. She started asking about my fence height and whether I had permits for my patio furniture. The message was clear. Associate with the troublemaker, and you become a target too. That's when I realized that Karen wasn't just a difficult neighbor or an overzealous HOA president. She was running a systematic campaign of intimidation designed to isolate anyone who opposed her authority. She was using the homeowners association as her personal enforcement mechanism, twisting community covenants into weapons of harassment. Worse, she was getting away with it because most people didn't have the time, money, or energy to fight back. Pay the fine, comply with the arbitrary demands, and hope she moved on to someone else. But I wasn't most people. I was someone who had spent decades studying criminal behavior, documenting patterns of abuse, and building cases against people who thought they were above the law. Every fake noise complaint, every fabricated photograph, every anonymous letter, every act of trespassing, I documented it all. Video footage, witness statements, correspondence records, violation notices with obvious inconsistencies. Karen thought she was dealing with a regular homeowner who would eventually break under pressure. She had no idea she was building a case against herself, creating evidence of harassment, filing false reports, and engaging in conduct that would get her removed from any position of authority. As I stood in my driveway tonight, watching her gleefully recite my alleged violations to Sheriff Martinez, I realized she was about to add one more charge to her growing list of offenses: filing a false police report. Because if there's one thing I learned in over 2 decades of law enforcement, it's that bullies always overreach. They always push too far, get too comfortable with their power, and eventually make the mistake that brings them down. Tonight, Karen Whitmore was making that mistake, and tomorrow, the entire neighborhood would see exactly what happens when petty tyranny meets actual justice. She thought I was just another homeowner. She had no idea. I'm the sheriff's boss. The identification in my wallet tells a story that Karen Whitmore could never have imagined. It's not just a driver's license. It's a county-issued photo ID that reads Director of Public Safety beneath my name. The same county where Sheriff Martinez works, the same department where he files his reports, attends his meetings, and receives his assignments. I've been carrying this secret for 18 months, watching Karen's reign of terror unfold while biting my tongue and documenting everything. Because sometimes the best way to catch a bully is to let them think they're winning right up until the moment they lose everything. My career in law enforcement started 23 years ago with the state police. Fresh out of college, idealistic about justice and public service, convinced I could make a difference by putting bad people behind bars and keeping communities safe. I worked patrol for 5 years, learning the streets and earning respect from veteran officers who had seen too many young recruits burn out or wash out. I made detective at 28, specializing in financial crimes and public corruption cases. There's something particularly satisfying about taking down criminals who abuse positions of trust. Politicians taking bribes, contractors cheating taxpayers, officials using public resources for personal gain. After 15 years with the state, I was recruited by the county to oversee their public safety department. It was a big job, managing not just the sheriff's department, but also emergency services, disaster response, and community safety programs. The kind of position that comes with real responsibility and real accountability. Sheriff Martinez was one of the first people I met when I took the job. He's a good man. 30 years of experience, deeply respected by his officers and the community. Completely trustworthy. The kind of sheriff who runs his department by the book and treats everyone with dignity, regardless of their economic status or political connections. He's also someone who understands that justice isn't just about arrests and convictions. Sometimes, it's about protecting good people from those who would abuse what little power they've been given. When I decided to move to Willowbrook Estates, I didn't think about HOA politics or neighborhood power structures. I was looking for a quiet place to live, close to work, with good neighbors and well-maintained properties. The Homeowners Association seemed like a reasonable way to maintain community standards and protect property values. I had no idea I was moving into the territory of a suburban dictator. My first few encounters with Karen Whitmore were merely annoying. Excessive fines, arbitrary enforcement, petty harassment. The kind of behavior you see from small-time officials who let a little authority go to their head. I figured it was a temporary problem that would resolve itself once reasonable people got involved. But as the harassment escalated and I learned about Karen's campaign of intimidation against other residents, I realized I was dealing with something more serious. This wasn't just about HOA violations or neighborhood disputes. This was about someone systematically abusing their position to terrorize an entire community. The fake noise complaints that brought sheriff's deputies to my door. The fabricated photographs used as evidence in violation notices. The trespassing incident where she placed trash bags on my property to manufacture violations. The anonymous harassment letters. The retaliatory targeting of neighbors who associated with me. Any one of these incidents could be dismissed as a misunderstanding or personality conflict. Taken together, they formed a clear pattern of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of authority. Could have ended it at any time. One phone call to Sheriff Martinez explaining the situation. One conversation about the frivolous emergency calls and false reports, and Karen's campaign would have stopped immediately. But that wouldn't have solved the real problem. It would have just driven her underground, made her more careful about her methods, taught her to be more subtle in her intimidation tactics. No, I needed Karen to reveal herself completely. I needed her arrogance and sense of impunity to be on full display, documented and witnessed by the entire community she had been terrorizing. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during a routine HOA meeting. I had started attending these meetings to observe Karen's behavior and document her abuse of authority. Most residents avoided them, intimidated by Karen's controlling presence and afraid of being singled out for retaliation. But I wasn't most residents. Karen called the meeting to order from her position at the head of the conference table, red clipboard at hand, reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose like a weapon of bureaucratic intimidation. First item on the agenda, she announced, is the ongoing violation patterns we've been seeing from certain residents who seem to think community covenants don't apply to them. She was talking about me, of course. Not by name, but everyone in the room understood the reference. Now, I want to be clear that the board takes these violations very seriously, she continued, gesturing to the two other board members who sat silently beside her, afraid to disagree with anything she said. We've attempted to work with non-compliant residents through the standard notice and fine procedure, but some individuals seem determined to challenge our authority. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who had warned me about mailbox colors, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The Hendersons, still traumatized by the garden gnome incident, stared at their hands. In extreme cases, Karen said, her voice taking on a tone of righteous authority, we may need to involve law enforcement to ensure compliance with community standards. That's when I raised my hand. I have a question about enforcement procedures, I said calmly. Karen's eyes narrowed. She hadn't expected to be questioned during her intimidation speech. This isn't a discussion period. Residents may submit written questions after the formal agenda is completed. I understand. But this is about enforcement procedures, which seems directly relevant to what you're discussing. She couldn't refuse without looking obviously dictatorial in front of the other residents. What's your question? You mentioned involving law enforcement for HOA violations. Can you explain under what circumstances sheriff's deputies would have authority to enforce homeowners association covenants? The question caught her off guard. She clearly had no idea about the actual legal boundaries between civil HOA disputes and criminal law enforcement. Well, obviously, if someone is violating community standards in ways that affect public safety or property values. But HOA covenants are civil matters, aren't they? Contractual disputes between the association and residents? Sheriff's deputies enforce criminal law, not private agreements. Karen's face was reddening. Are you trying to lecture me about legal procedures? I'm just trying to understand the process. Have you consulted with law enforcement about the scope of their authority in HOA matters? I don't need to justify our enforcement procedures to you. Of course not. I'm sure you've done your homework on the legal issues involved. That's when she made her fatal mistake. Standing up at the head of the table, red clipboard clutched in her hand like a shield, Karen Whitmore revealed exactly who she thought she was. Let me make something very clear, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. I am the elected president of this homeowners association. I have authority over community standards, property compliance, and enforcement procedures. And if residents like you think you can intimidate me or challenge my authority, you're going to learn otherwise. She paused, making eye contact with everyone in the room to make sure they understood the threat. The sheriff's department understands the importance of maintaining community standards. They know that property values and public safety go hand in hand. And when I call them about problem residents, they listen to me. The silence in the room was deafening. Residents stared at their hands, afraid to make eye contact with anyone, terrified of being identified as Karen's next target. But I wasn't afraid. I was documenting. Every word, every threat, every abuse of authority was going into the case file I'd been building for months. Thank you for clarifying your position, I said quietly. I think everyone here has a very clear understanding of how you view your role in this community. After the meeting, several residents approached me privately. They were scared, but they were also angry. For 3 years, they had lived under Karen's arbitrary rule, paying frivolous fines and accepting ridiculous restrictions rather than risk becoming her primary target. But Karen had overplayed her hand, her public threat to use law enforcement. As her personal enforcement mechanism had crossed a line that even intimidated neighbors couldn't ignore, that's when I realized the time for passive documentation was ending. Karen had declared war on the entire community, using the threat of legal consequences to maintain her power. She had specifically threatened to manipulate law enforcement for personal vendettas. What she didn't know was that she had just threatened to manipulate my own department, under my own authority, to settle her personal grievances. As I drove home from that meeting, I made a decision. I would give Karen exactly what she was asking for. I would let her call the sheriff about my alleged violations. I would let her believe she had the power to bring law enforcement to my door. And then, when she was standing in my driveway, gloating over her perceived victory, I would teach her and the entire neighborhood a lesson about real authority versus petty tyranny. Tonight, with Sheriff Martinez standing between us and the whole neighborhood watching from their windows, that lesson was about to begin. For years, she made us fear her. But fear only works until one person refuses to bow. The morning after the HOA meeting where Karen had threatened to use law enforcement as her personal weapon, I knew it was time to stop playing defense. But I also knew that taking down a neighborhood bully required more than just exposing her to my professional colleagues. It required giving the community she had terrorized the courage to stand up for themselves. That meant reaching out to my neighbors, one conversation at a time, in the quiet spaces where Karen's surveillance couldn't reach. My first stop was Tom Rodriguez. I found him Saturday morning working in his garage, trying to stay out of sight while he organized tools that Karen would probably find some way to cite as a covenant violation. "Tom, you got a minute?" I asked, pulling my car into his driveway to block the view from Karen's house. He looked nervous, glancing toward her window. "Yeah, sure. What's up?" "I want to talk to you about Karen's harassment campaign. Not just against me, against everyone in this neighborhood." Tom's shoulders sagged. "Man, I don't want to get involved in whatever's going on between you two. I've got kids to think about, and she's already started looking for reasons to fine me. That's exactly what I want to talk about. She's counting on everyone being too afraid to speak up. But what if I told you there was a way to stop her permanently?" He set down the wrench he was holding. "Stop her how?" I explained carefully, without revealing my position with the county. I told him about the documentation I'd been collecting, the pattern of harassment and intimidation, the abuse of authority that went far beyond normal HOA enforcement. "Look, Tom, what she's doing isn't just annoying, it's illegal. Filing false police reports, trespassing on private property, using her position to retaliate against residents who question her authority. These are crimes, not civil disputes. But who's going to listen? She's got the sheriff wrapped around her finger." I smiled. "What if I told you that's not as true as she thinks it is?" Over the next hour, Tom told me stories I hadn't heard before. Karen demanding to inspect his backyard fence, claiming she needed to verify its height against covenant specifications. Karen taking photographs of his children's toys in the driveway, claiming they were unsightly storage that violated community standards. Karen questioning his wife about their work schedules, claiming she was investigating suspicious activity patterns. "The worst part," Tom said, "is watching my kids tiptoe around their own yard, afraid to play normally because Karen might be watching." What kind of childhood is that? By the time I left his garage, Tom had agreed to document every interaction with Karen going forward, and to reach out to other neighbors who might have similar stories. My next conversation was with Sarah Mitchell, the single mother who had been fined for letting her 10-year-old son play basketball after sunset. I found her at the neighborhood park, watching her son practice free throws while other children played nearby. "Sarah, I wanted to ask you about your experience with the HOA." Chatterjee looked around nervously, as if Karen might emerge from behind the playground equipment. "Why? Are you going to report something to her?" "Just the opposite. I'm trying to document the pattern of harassment she's been using against residents who don't comply with her demands. Sarah's expression shifted from fear to something approaching. Hope. You mean other people are having problems with her too? Sarah, everyone in the neighborhood is having problems with her. The question is whether we're going to keep letting her get away with it. The story that came out over the next 30 minutes was heartbreaking. Karen hadn't just fined Sarah for the basketball incident, she had launched a systematic campaign of intimidation designed to punish a single mother who couldn't afford to fight back. She shows up at my door at least twice a week, Sarah explained, watching her son shoot baskets while she talked. Always with that clipboard, always finding something wrong. The mailbox needs touching up. There's a tricycle visible from the street. My car is parked 2 inches over the driveway line. How much have you paid in fines? Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Over $3,000 in the past year. I had to take out a personal loan to pay them, because she threatened to put a lien on my house. $3,000 for mailbox paint and visible toys and parking that was allegedly 2 inches off-center. Sarah, what she's doing is extortion. She's using her position to extract money from residents through threats and intimidation. But she's the HOA president. Don't I have to follow the covenants? You have to follow reasonable enforcement of legitimate covenants. You don't have to submit to harassment and financial abuse. By the time our conversation ended, Sarah had agreed to compile records of every fine Karen had imposed and every interaction they'd had. More importantly, she had started to believe that resistance was possible. The pattern repeated itself across the neighborhood. The elderly Hendersons, terrorized over garden gnomes their deceased husband had given them 40 years ago. Mrs. Chen fined repeatedly for mailbox colors that were indistinguishable to the naked eye. Mike Patterson, the former HOA candidate who had been driven out of the race by retaliatory harassment. Each conversation revealed new details about Karen's methods. The way she would photograph violations from angles that made them look worse than they were. The way she would interpret covenant language in the most restrictive possible manner. The way she would escalate enforcement against anyone who questioned her authority. But more importantly, each conversation revealed neighbors who were ready to fight back if they believed they had support. The breakthrough came during a conversation with retired police officer Bill Morrison, who lived 2 streets over from me. I found him washing his car in his driveway, working methodically to avoid any spot that Karen might cite as a water stain violation. You know, Bill said, scrubbing at his wheels, in 30 years on the force, I arrested a lot of people for harassment and intimidation. What Karen's doing would have been enough for charges in my jurisdiction. What kind of charges? Stalking, for starters. Following people around, photographing their activities, showing up at their homes repeatedly, despite being asked to stop. Extortion, using threats to obtain money. Filing false reports. Those fake noise complaints and fabricated violation photographs. Bill straightened up, wringing out his washcloth. The thing is, bullies like Karen rely on their victims being isolated. They pick off people one at a time, make each person think they're the only one being targeted. So how do you stop them? You document everything. You coordinate with other victims, and you present a united front to the authorities. Bullies are cowards. They fold as soon as they realize their victims aren't going to stay silent. That's when I knew we had the foundation for something bigger than individual resistance. We had the makings of a community response that would end Karen's reign of terror permanently. Over the following 2 weeks, a network of communication developed among Karen's targets. Not anything formal or obvious, just neighbors talking to neighbors, sharing stories, comparing notes, building a comprehensive picture of the harassment campaign that had been terrorizing Willowbrook Estates for 3 years. The stories were remarkably consistent. Karen would identify a target, usually someone who had questioned her authority or failed to immediately comply with one of her demands. She would then subject that person to intensive scrutiny, finding violations that other residents were never cited for, imposing fines that were far out of proportion to any actual harm, and escalating the harassment until the target either submitted completely or moved away. But the most important discovery was that Karen's behavior had been getting worse, not better. The fake noise complaints, the fabricated photographs, the trespassing incidents. These were new tactics that she had developed as her sense of impunity grew. She was becoming sloppy, overconfident, convinced that her authority was absolute and that no one would ever challenge her effectively. That's when I realized she was about to make the mistake that would bring her down. Karen had spent 3 years terrorizing individual residents, confident that her victims would never unite against her. But now, for the first time, the people she had been bullying were talking to each other, sharing information, building a case, and more importantly, they were losing their fear. The change was subtle at first. Mrs. Chen started leaving her incorrectly colored mailbox unpainted, daring Karen to write another violation notice. Tom Rodriguez began letting his children play in the driveway during normal hours, regardless of Karen's complaints about excessive noise. Sarah Mitchell was the first to actively resist. When Karen showed up at her door with another frivolous violation notice, this time claiming that a bicycle in the garage was visible from the street and therefore in violation of storage regulations, Sarah didn't apologize or promise to comply. Instead, she said calmly, "Karen, I think you should know that I've been documenting every interaction we've had, including the $3,000 in fines you've imposed over the past year. I've also been talking to other neighbors about their experiences with your enforcement methods. Karen's face went white. "Are you threatening me? I'm informing you that your pattern of harassment is being documented and that the community is aware of your tactics." That night, Karen called the sheriff's department with another fake noise complaint about my house. But this time, Deputy Williams didn't just apologize and leave. He mentioned that they had been receiving an unusual number of anonymous complaints from this neighborhood, all of which turned out to be unfounded. "Probably just a neighbor dispute," he said. "But you might want to consider installing security cameras if someone's targeting your property with false reports." I already had security cameras, of course, and they had recorded Karen making the phone call from her front porch while staring directly at my house. The next morning, she found a different kind of violation notice on her own door. Not from me, but from Tom Rodriguez, who had decided to file a formal complaint with the county about harassment by an HOA board member. Karen's kingdom of fear was crumbling, one neighbor at a time, but she still believed she had one final weapon in her arsenal: the nuclear option of calling law enforcement to my door for a dramatic confrontation that would reestablish her authority in front of the entire community. She had no idea that when she made that call, she would be summoning the very person who had been orchestrating her downfall all along. Tonight, as I stood in my driveway watching her recite my alleged violations to Sheriff Martinez, I could see neighbors at their windows, not hiding in fear, but watching with anticipation, finally ready to see justice served. The community had found its courage. Now it was time to give them their victory. The night she called the sheriff on me was the night she signed her own downfall. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. I was reviewing budget reports for the next county commission meeting when my personal phone rang with Sheriff Martinez's number on the caller ID. "Director," he said, his voice carrying the weary professionalism of a veteran cop who'd seen every kind of domestic dispute. "I've got a situation in your neighborhood that I think you should know about before I respond. I set down my pen. What kind of situation? Anonymous noise complaint about your address. Fourth one this month. All from the same caller based on the voice pattern. All turning out to be unfounded when we investigate. I could hear the engine of his patrol car in the background, already heading toward Willowbrook Estates. You think this is harassment? I know it's harassment. The question is whether you want me to handle this as a normal call or whether there's something bigger going on here. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Karen had finally made the mistake that would expose her to the full weight of law. Enforcement scrutiny, not as the self-appointed neighborhood authority she pretended to be, but as a private citizen filing false reports. Handle it normally, Sheriff, I said, but document everything carefully. I have a feeling tonight's call is going to be the last piece of evidence we need. Evidence for what? A case I've been building for the past 18 months. I'll explain. Everything after you finish the call. 20 minutes later, I watched from my bedroom window as the familiar pattern played out in my driveway. Sheriff Martinez's cruiser pulling up, neighbors peeking through curtains, and Karen Whitmore emerging from her house like a general taking command of a battlefield. But this time was different. This time, Karen wasn't just filing another anonymous complaint. She was making a public spectacle of her authority, demanding action in front of witnesses, putting herself at the center of what she believed would be my final humiliation. Outwine dressed quickly and walked outside, playing the role of confused homeowner one last time, while Karen recited her litany of accusations to Sheriff Martinez. That's him, Sheriff Martinez, the one I've been telling you about. He thinks he can just ignore every rule, every regulation we've put in place to maintain property values and community standards. I watched Sheriff Martinez's face as he recognized me in the flashing lights of his cruiser. To his credit, he didn't betray any surprise, just made notes on his clipboard and asked the professional questions he was trained to ask. Ma'am, you said this was an emergency situation requiring immediate law enforcement response. Karen launched into her prepared speech about illegal modifications, unauthorized vehicles, noise violations, and tonight's allegedly illegal gathering. Each accusation was delivered with the righteous authority of someone who had never been challenged, never been questioned, never been held accountable for her actions. This man has violated multiple HOA covenants, illegal modifications to his property, unauthorized vehicles, noise violations, and tonight, he's hosting some kind of illegal gathering after hours. The illegal gathering she was referring to was me having Tom Rodriguez and Bill Morrison over for coffee to discuss our documentation of her harassment campaign. 3 neighbors talking quietly in a living room had somehow become, in Karen's mind, a violation of community standards requiring immediate police intervention. But the beautiful thing about Karen's overconfidence was that she couldn't help herself from escalating. When Sheriff Martinez asked routine questions about the alleged violations, she didn't just answer. She delivered a speech about her authority, her role in maintaining community standards, and her relationship with law enforcement. I am elected by this community to serve their best interests. I don't abuse anything. I protect property values and maintain order. By calling the sheriff at midnight over Christmas lights and garden gnomes, I asked, keeping my voice calm while neighbors watched from their windows. By doing whatever it takes to maintain community standards, even if that means dealing with residents who think they're above the rules. That's when she made the statement that would end her reign of terror forever. The sheriff's department understands the importance of maintaining community standards. They know that property values and public safety go hand in hand. And when I call them about problem residents, they listen to me. I saw Sheriff Martinez's pen pause over his clipboard. In a single sentence, Karen had revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of law enforcement's role in civil HOA disputes, her abuse of emergency services for personal vendettas, and her belief that she could manipulate police resources for private enforcement. More importantly, she had said it loudly enough for half the neighborhood to hear, including several residents who were recording the confrontation from their windows. "These are serious allegations, sir," Sheriff Martinez said, maintaining his professional demeanor while building the case that would support the charges I would file tomorrow. "Violation of HOA covenants can result in fines, liens against your property, even legal action." Karen practically bounced with excitement. She thought she was witnessing my public downfall, the moment when the full weight of legal authority would crush my resistance to her rule. Exactly. Finally, someone understands the severity of the situation. I've been trying to maintain order in this community for 3 years, and this man has been nothing but defiant. 3 years, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. That's a long time to hold power over people's lives. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Karen digging her grave deeper with every word. She bragged about her files of documented violations, her photographic evidence, her relationship with law enforcement. She threatened escalation if I didn't comply with her demands. She made it clear that this wasn't about community standards. It was about submission to her personal authority. Finally, Sheriff Martinez asked for my identification. The moment of truth had arrived. I reached for my wallet slowly, savoring Karen's expression of triumph. She had no idea that the simple act of opening my wallet would destroy everything she had built over 3 years of neighborhood tyranny. "Of course, Sheriff," I said, pulling out my county-issued ID, "though I think you might find this situation more complicated than either of us initially realized." Sheriff Martinez looked at my identification, then looked at Karen, then looked back at me. I could see him processing the implications, understanding that what he had assumed was a neighborhood dispute was actually something much more serious. Karen was still smiling, still convinced she had won, still unaware that her world was about to change forever. "Ma'am," Sheriff Martinez said quietly, "I think you need to know who you're dealing with." Karen's smile faltered slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "This is Director Thompson. He's my supervisor at the County Public Safety Department." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the night sounds seemed to pause as Karen processed what she had just heard. "What?" she stammered. "Karen," I said, stepping forward into the flashing light of the patrol car. "I'm the man who signs his paychecks. And now, I'm investigating you." The color drained from Karen's face so completely that she looked like a ghost in the red and blue lights. Around us, I could hear gasps and whispers from neighbors who had been watching from their windows, finally understanding why I had never seemed intimidated by her threats. This is impossible," Karen whispered. "You're just You live in—" "I'm the Director of Public Safety for this county," I said calmly. "I oversee the Sheriff's Department, emergency services, and community safety programs. And for the past 18 months, I've been documenting a pattern of harassment, intimidation, filing false reports, and abuse of authority by an HOA board member." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Sheriff Martinez was writing furiously on his clipboard, documenting everything she had said about manipulating law enforcement for HOA violations. "Every fake noise complaint," I continued, "every fabricated violation notice, every act of trespassing, every threat of legal action. It's all been documented. Video evidence, witness statements, correspondence records, violation notices with obvious inconsistencies. But you can't, Karen sputtered. Actually, I can. And I will. Because what you've been doing isn't HOA enforcement. It's criminal harassment. And it ends tonight. The neighborhood had gone completely silent, except for the sound of Karen's ragged breathing and the scratch of Sheriff Martinez's pen on his clipboard. "Ma'am," Sheriff Martinez said professionally, "I'm going to need you to step over here so we can discuss your complaint in more detail." As Karen walked unsteadily toward the patrol car, her red clipboard clutched against her chest, like armor that had suddenly become useless. I could see neighbors beginning to emerge from their houses. Tom Rodriguez appeared on his front porch, no longer afraid to be seen. Sarah Mitchell stepped into her driveway, her son beside her, both of them smiling for the first time in months. The Queen of Willowbrook Estates had just discovered that her kingdom was built on a foundation of fear that could be shattered by a single revelation of truth. And tomorrow, the entire community would learn that their reign of terror was finally over. When the truth came out, the Queen of the HOA lost her crown in front of everyone. The emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Thursday evening. Karen had sent out the notices through her usual channels: formal letterhead, official language, mandatory attendance strongly encouraged. But this time, she wasn't calling the meeting to intimidate residents or announce new violations. She was fighting for her political life. Word had spread through the neighborhood faster than a wildfire. The man Karen had been harassing for 18 months wasn't just another homeowner. He was the county official who supervised law enforcement. The woman who claimed to have the sheriff's department in her pocket had been unknowingly terrorizing the sheriff's boss. By 7 p.m., the community center was packed beyond capacity. Residents who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years filled every seat, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallway. These weren't the usual intimidated homeowners who showed up out of fear. These were people who smelled blood in the water and wanted to witness the final confrontation. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a banker's box filled with 18 months of documentation. Every fake noise complaint, every fabricated photograph, every threatening letter, every violation notice with obvious inconsistencies. The evidence that would end Karen's reign of terror permanently. Sheriff Martinez was already there, in uniform, sitting in the front row. Not as Karen's ally, but as a witness to what was about to unfold. Karen sat at the head table, flanked by the other two board members who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Her red clipboard was positioned precisely in front of her, but her hands were shaking slightly as she shuffled through papers. She had tried to control the damage over the past week. Phone calls to residents, emails claiming the Tuesday night incident was a misunderstanding, attempts to frame the confrontation as harassment of an elected official. But the story was too big, too dramatic, too satisfying for neighbors who had been living in fear for 3 years. Karen called the meeting to order with her usual authoritative tone, but there was a brittleness to her voice that hadn't been there before. "This emergency meeting has been called to address recent attacks on the integrity of your elected HOA leadership," she began, looking directly at me. "There have been false accusations, character assassination attempts, and coordinated efforts to undermine the authority of this board." A murmur went through the crowd. Tom Rodriguez, sitting 3 rows back, actually laughed out loud. "The first item on tonight's agenda," Karen continued, "is to clarify the proper procedures for residents who have concerns about HOA enforcement. All complaints must be submitted in writing, through proper channels, following established protocols." I raised my hand. Karen's eyes narrowed. "This is not a discussion period. Residents may submit questions after. I'm not here as a resident tonight, I said, standing up. I'm here as a county official investigating allegations of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of authority by an HOA board member. The room went completely silent. Karen's face flushed. Red, but she tried to maintain control. You have no authority over this homeowners association. This is a private organization, governed by our covenants and elected leadership. I opened my banker's box and pulled out the first file. Actually, I have authority over criminal behavior, regardless of where it occurs or who commits it. There is no criminal behavior here, Karen snapped. Only a disgruntled resident who refuses to follow community standards and is now trying to intimidate elected officials. Let's talk about intimidation, I said, opening the file. Over the past 18 months, you have made 12 fake noise complaints to the sheriff's department about my address. Every single call was investigated. Every single call was determined to be unfounded. I held up the dispatch records. Filing false police reports is a misdemeanor crime punishable by up to 1 year in jail. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. You have also engaged in trespassing on private property for the purpose of manufacturing HOA violations. I pulled out a USB drive. I have video evidence of you placing trash bags on my property, photographing them as violations, and then removing them. The crowd was leaning forward, hanging on every word. These were neighbors who had been terrorized by Karen's arbitrary enforcement, and they were finally seeing justice in action. Furthermore, I continued, you have used your position as HOA president to systematically harass residents who questioned your authority. Sarah Mitchell has paid over $3,000 in frivolous fines over the past year. The Hendersons were threatened with legal action over garden gnomes that violated no actual covenant. Tom Rodriguez was subjected to retaliatory enforcement after supporting my candidacy in private conversations. Each revelation brought gasps from the audience. Neighbors began nodding, recognizing their own stories in the pattern of abuse I was describing. These aren't HOA enforcement actions, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. This is a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation designed to maintain absolute control over this community through fear. Karen finally found her voice. This is a witch hunt, a coordinated attack by someone who refuses to accept legitimate authority. Legitimate authority, I repeated. Let's talk about that. I pulled out another file. You told Sheriff Martinez that when you call the sheriff's department about problem residents, they listen to you. You claimed that law enforcement understands the importance of maintaining community standards and that property values and public safety go hand in hand. Sheriff Martinez stood up from the front row. Ma'am, I think it's important for everyone here to understand that the sheriff's department has no authority to enforce HOA covenants. Our jurisdiction covers criminal law, not private contractual disputes. Karen was sweating now, her carefully constructed authority crumbling in front of the entire community. Moreover, Sheriff Martinez continued, using emergency services for frivolous complaints is itself a crime. Filing false reports, making threats of legal action without basis, and claiming to have law enforcement support for private vendettas. These are serious offenses. The crowd erupted. Neighbors who had been silent for 3 years suddenly found their voices, sharing stories of Karen's harassment, her arbitrary fines, her threats of legal action. The community center filled with the sound of people finally feeling safe to speak. Karen tried to restore order, banging her clipboard on the table like a gavel. This is completely out of order. I am the elected president of this association, and I will not be subjected to this kind of attack. You were elected. I said quietly, and the room fell silent again. But you've abused that trust systematically and criminally. I pulled out the final file. Harassment of residents through arbitrary enforcement, filing false police reports, trespassing on private property, misuse of official position, extortion through threatened legal action. These aren't political differences. They're criminal charges. The two other board members were staring at Karen with horror, finally understanding the legal jeopardy she had created for the entire HOA through her actions. I'm recommending that the district attorney review these charges for prosecution, I continued. I'm also recommending that this community hold immediate elections to replace board members who have violated their fiduciary duties to residents. Karen stood up shakily, clutching her red clipboard. You can't do this. I've maintained property values, enforced standards, kept this community safe. You've terrorized your neighbors, Tom Rodriguez called out from the back of the room. You've stolen thousands of dollars through frivolous fines, Sarah Mitchell added, standing with her son beside her. You made us afraid to live in our own homes, said Mrs. Chen, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. Karen looked around the room, seeing nothing but angry faces where once there had been fearful submission. Her kingdom of intimidation had collapsed completely, and she was just a woman with a clipboard facing the consequences of 3 years of abuse. This meeting is adjourned, she said weakly. No, I said firmly. This meeting is just beginning. Sheriff Martinez, would you please escort Ms. Whitmore outside so the residents can discuss their options for new leadership? As Sheriff Martinez approached the head table, Karen made one final attempt to assert her authority. You can't remove me. I'm elected. I have authority. You had authority, Sheriff Martinez said gently. Now you have the right to remain silent. The community center erupted in applause as Karen was led outside, her red clipboard falling forgotten on the floor. For the first time in 3 years, the residents of Willowbrook Estates were free to speak without fear, free to participate in their community association without intimidation, free to live in their own homes without terror. The Queen was dead. Long live the community. The day Karen lost her power was the day our neighborhood finally breathed again. 3 weeks after the emergency HOA meeting, I stood in my front yard at sunset, watching children play basketball in the driveway across the street without looking over their shoulders in fear. The sound of their laughter carried across the neighborhood like music, a sound that had been missing from Willowbrook Estates for far too long. Karen Whitmore was gone, not just from the HOA board, but from the neighborhood entirely. The criminal charges I had recommended, filing false police reports, harassment, trespassing, and abuse of official position, had been filed by the district attorney within a week of our confrontation. Rather than face trial and the certainty of conviction, Karen had accepted a plea agreement that included hefty fines, community service, and a permanent restraining order preventing her from holding any position of authority in homeowners associations. She had sold her house and moved across the county, leaving behind the kingdom she had ruled through fear and intimidation. The transformation of the community was remarkable. Where once neighbors had avoided eye contact and hurried past each other's homes to avoid Karen's scrutiny, now people lingered in their driveways to chat, organized block parties, and worked together on genuine community improvements. The new HOA board, elected in a meeting that drew 90% of residents, had immediately rescinded Karen's most ridiculous regulations. Mailbox colors were no longer policed with military precision. Christmas lights could stay up until February if residents wanted. Garden gnomes were not only permitted, but celebrated. The Hendersons had added 3 new ones to their collection. gifts from neighbors who wanted to show solidarity. But more than the specific rule changes, the entire culture of the neighborhood had shifted. The Homeowners Association had returned to its original purpose, maintaining genuinely important community standards while respecting residents' rights and dignity. Sarah Mitchell had been elected to the new board, along with Tom Rodriguez and Bill Morrison. Their first act was to establish a formal complaint process that required evidence, offered due process, and imposed penalties that were proportional to actual violations. Their second act was to refund over $15,000 in frivolous fines that Karen had imposed during her reign of terror. The money came from the HOA's reserve fund, which had been mysteriously depleted during Karen's tenure. Apparently, enforcing arbitrary regulations required expensive legal consultations and administrative overhead. Sheriff Martinez stopped by my house a few days after Karen's departure, not on an emergency call but for a friendly conversation between colleagues. "You know," he said, sitting on my front porch with a cup of coffee, "in 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen a more elegant takedown of a bully. You let her hang herself with her own rope." I learned a long time ago that the best way to deal with tyrants is to let them reveal their true nature in public, I replied. Karen thought she was untouchable because no one had ever stood up to her effectively. But bullies are always more fragile than they appear. The fake noise complaints should have been a red flag for us, Sheriff Martinez admitted. We get so many nuisance calls that we sometimes miss patterns of abuse. You responded professionally every time. The problem wasn't your response. It was that Karen had convinced herself she could manipulate law enforcement for personal vendettas. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the neighborhood come alive with the normal activities that had been suppressed during Karen's rule. Kids riding bikes without worrying about violating invisible boundaries. Neighbors working in their gardens without fear of arbitrary citations. People decorating their homes according to their own tastes rather than Karen's rigid aesthetic demands. "You think she'll try this again somewhere else?" Sheriff Martinez asked. "Maybe, but she'll be more careful now, and hopefully her new neighbors will recognize the warning signs before she gets too entrenched." The most satisfying part of Karen's downfall wasn't the legal consequences or even her exile from the neighborhood. It was watching the community rediscover its voice and its power. Mrs. Chen, who had once whispered warnings about mailbox colors, now served as the neighborhood's unofficial historian, documenting the positive changes and making sure new residents understood their rights. Tom Rodriguez had started a neighborhood watch program, a real one focused on actual safety rather than covenant enforcement. The Hendersons had begun hosting monthly potluck dinners in their backyard, surrounded by their expanding collection of garden gnomes. Even the physical appearance of the neighborhood had improved. Without the threat of arbitrary fines hanging over every decorative choice, residents were investing more in their properties, adding personal touches that reflected their personalities, and making Willowbrook Estates feel like a real community, rather than a sterile development. The ultimate irony was that property values had actually increased after Karen's departure. When homes are owned by people who enjoy living in them rather than people who fear their own HOA, the difference shows. I kept my role in Karen's downfall as low-key as possible. Most neighbors knew I worked for the county, but I didn't advertise my specific position or authority. The victory belonged to the community, not to any individual. It was their courage to speak up, their willingness to document Karen's abuses, and their unity in demanding change that had made the difference. But there was one conversation that made the entire 18 months of harassment worthwhile. I was mowing my lawn on a Saturday morning when a car pulled up to the curb. A middle-aged woman got out, looking nervous but determined. "Excuse me," she called. Are you the man who dealt with the HOA problem here? I turned off the mower. I'm one of several people who helped address some issues with the previous board. Can I help you? My name is Janet Williams. I live in Oakwood Commons, about 10 miles from here. We have an HOA president who's, well, she sounds a lot like what I've heard about your former president. Janet went on to describe a situation that was remarkably similar to what we had experienced with Karen. Arbitrary fines, harassment of residents who questioned authority, fake violations, and threats of legal action. The same pattern of abuse, just in a different neighborhood. The thing is, Janet said, some of our neighbors heard about what happened here. How you stood up to her, how you documented everything, how you finally stopped her. We were wondering, could you give us some advice? I spent the next hour explaining the process we had used to document Karen's harassment, build community unity, and present evidence to proper authorities. But more importantly, I explained that the real power had come from neighbors supporting each other and refusing to be intimidated. The key is understanding that bullies like your HOA president rely on isolation and fear, I told Janet. Once residents start talking to each other, comparing stories, and documenting patterns of abuse, the bully's power disappears. Janet left with a notebook full of advice and a renewed sense of hope. 6 months later, I received a thank you card from the residents of Oakwood Commons. Their tyrannical HOA president had been removed from office and was facing criminal charges for harassment and filing false reports. The ripple effect of standing up to one neighborhood bully had spread to protect other communities from similar abuse. As I write this, 2 years after that midnight confrontation in my driveway, Willowbrook Estates is everything a neighborhood should be. Children play freely, neighbors help each other with genuine problems, and the Homeowners Association serves the community rather than ruling it. Karen Whitmore thought she understood power. She believed that authority came from fear, that control meant submission, and that leadership meant never being questioned. She was wrong on every count. Real authority comes from serving others. Real control means empowering people to improve their own lives. Real leadership means being accountable to the people you serve. Karen forgot the most important lesson about power. It's not something you take by force and hold through intimidation. It's something that communities grant to people they trust, and it can be withdrawn the moment that trust is betrayed. The queen of the HOA thought she was untouchable. She forgot that in America, even kings answer to the people they serve, and sometimes the people they serve know exactly how to remind them of that fact. As the sun sets over our peaceful neighborhood, I can hear the sounds of a healthy community. Children playing, neighbors talking, families enjoying their homes without fear. It's the sound of justice restored, of balance returned, of a community that learned to stand up for itself. Karen called the sheriff that night, thinking she was bringing the law down on a troublesome neighbor. She never realized she was calling her own boss. And in the end, that made all the difference.